Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you can join us today. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking with an individual I quote quite often in commentaries, and we've also had a chance to interview him, Arthur Brooks. But before we do that, let me just mention that the rest of our time today will be looking at a number of things, especially Ukraine. Today, the Ukrainian president actually addressed Congress, cited Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attacks, and we're going to talk about what he said, the response from Congress, and we'll get into that in some detail. Also, if you look at your calendar, you recognize that today is March 16th. 2 years ago, on March 16th, 2020, remember 15 days to slow the spread? 15 days ended up going almost 2 years. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts about that as we look back to something that happened 2 years ago. And of course, we have all sorts of topics we will be addressing after we've spent some time talking with Dr. Arthur Brooks. You've heard me interview him before, and also I think I first began to notice him when he wrote the book, Who Really Cares, and talking about who actually are giving. You know, liberals talk about giving, but conservatives tend to give more their time, their money, even blood. Of course, we've talked with him about the battle, the road to freedom, about the whole issue of the free enterprise system. Love your enemies. Last time we had him on the program, but this new book, From Strength to Strength. Last time we talked with him, he was, of course, president of the American Enterprise Institute, but now actually serves as a professor of practice of public leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, and also professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. An individual so gifted, including musically, because of course he played the French horn for ensembles both in the United States and Spain. So Dr. Arthur Brooks, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you. Great to be with you. I've missed you. It's been 3 years since I've been on the show.
Well, we need to solve that problem, but first of all, this book will help us get there. One of those is a very significant issue, because we've talked with you before about happiness oftentimes comes from earned success. And you open the story, which is really kind of gripping, a man on the plane who changed my life. You're hearing this individual sort of suicidal, looks like he wants to end life. You expected to actually find somebody when the lights on the plane went on, to be somebody that's fairly old, had really missed opportunities. And you look around, and this is a really famous person who nevertheless did not necessarily feel like he was having success, a purpose, and happiness. And that's really what your new book, From Strength to Strength, is all about.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, a lot of the listeners, if they remember our previous conversations, they were somewhat political in nature, because I was running a think tank in Washington, D.C., but my academic background is as a social scientist, and I've always studied human happiness, and that's what this book is about. This is a book that is basically a 401k plan for happiness, and it makes the claim that we don't have to leave our happiness up to chance, and we can get happier as we get older if we learn a certain set of habits. This is basically the 7 habits that all people have in common who get happier as they get older, who are happier at 75 than they are at 25. And the story really does start with a conversation I overheard on an airplane where a man was confessing to his wife that he might as well be dead. And I just figured he was somebody disappointed, didn't live up to his own standards. But when I turned around, I saw that it was one of the most famous men in the world. And I realized that early success in life is just no indication. It's no insurance policy against the idea that you should live better as you get older. Banking your satisfaction, banking your success just doesn't work. You need certain habits. You need to cultivate them and practice them, and they're all in this book, From Strength to Strength.
Again, this book has been out for a little while, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have an opportunity for you to order it on hardback and Kindle. And one of the things you talk about, you use a couple of graphs, and one of those is the productivity for an individual really seems to reach a peak about 20 years after career inception, because that's part of, and I know we don't want to necessarily get people too despondent or discouraged, but your professional decline is coming. But then you give us good hope in that you also talk about a second curve. So there's a sense in which sometimes, even though we may say, maybe my good years are behind me, there's something else coming down the road, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And one of the key things I want listeners to understand is that most people that have a first wave of success, they have something that psychologists called fluid intelligence that increases through the 20s and 30s. The ability to get better at your job. It's really what makes you good, whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or an electrician or a bus driver. It's what makes you better and better at your job if you put in the work to get it done. Most people tend to peak in their fluid intelligence in their late 20s and late 30s and early 40s, which is why a lot of people in their mid-40s, they start feeling kind of burned out, kind of bored by their jobs. It's kind of getting harder to do what once was easier. That's the bad news. The really good news is that psychologists see another kind of intelligence that comes in behind it called crystallized intelligence. It's true that it's not as easy to do things that once were easy, but it's much easier to do other things like teaching, supervising other people, putting people together in teams. That's called crystallized intelligence,
yes.
And it's based on wisdom, not just hard work and raw smarts. And if you use your wisdom, if you use your ability to teach and explain and help other people, that gets better in your 50s and 60s and stays high in your 70s and 80s, and true success and happiness can be yours.
And again, example of stagnation, if you will. Early on in your book, you talk about Charles Darwin. You know, what a monumental book, whether you agree with it or not. And there was a lot of reasons to disagree with it on the origin of species. But in a sense, the rest of his life, he really didn't have any significant success. He didn't break new ground. Of course, he wrote The Descent of Man and some others. But the bottom line is that you give some examples of individuals that were very famous, in this case, even buried with honors in England, but nevertheless sort of hit their peak early on and never did anything after that.
Yeah, they were on their fluid intelligence curve, and that's the only curve they ever knew about. And so they just pined away for those past successes early in life. Charles Darwin, many Nobel Prize winners are this way, Nobel Prize winning scientists, physicists, chemists, they had their greatest years with their fluid intelligence. And what they don't know is that their greater intelligence curve, their crystallized intelligence curve, comes later. So each one of us, we may not be Nobel Prize winning scientists, we may not be Charles Darwin, but we're geniuses in our own way. God gives us these incredible abilities to do whatever our gifts would suggest that we can do. But he also gives us the ability to have greater successes if we move from individual capacity to lifting other people up, which is so incredibly important, to use our wisdom to actually teach. And so sometime for each one of us somewhere between our late 30s until our early 50s, we need to look out for the changing in our interests and skills and start moving toward that crystallized intelligence curve. In this book, From Strength to Strength, it gives you step-by-step instructions on how exactly to do that for each one of us so that we can get happier as we age.
We'll come back and spend just a little bit more time with Arthur Brooks as we talk about those step-by-step ideas. The book has been out for a while, so I doubt that you will have any difficulty finding it in a local bookstore. But if you do, we also have a link to it as well. From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life. Individual that I quote so often and certainly have such great respect for. And again, he is now back into his area of social science, but also just answering questions about happiness and fulfillment and success. And we'll talk about that with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Why did Vladimir Putin decide to invade Ukraine? There are many reasons. One that is often ignored is the Afghanistan humiliation. The American military don't want to mention it. They're responsible for much of it. The establishment press doesn't really want to talk about it. That's old news, and the focus is always on the present. In an ideal world, the American military is supposed to act as a deterrent. Dictators and terrorists should think twice before challenging the U.S. military. In the best of all worlds, we would welcome the fact that the military is such a deterrent that we never have to use it. The botched withdrawal from Afghanistan changed all of that. We left behind what some estimate to be $80 billion in military arms and other equipment. We left behind Bagram Air Base after having spent $96 million on 2 long runways. And don't forget the $1 billion embassy in Kabul. The U.S. packed up and flew out of the country, leaving behind many who deserve to travel with us. An effective military should frighten our enemies and encourage our allies. But does anyone seriously think leaders in other countries will trust us in the future? They may place their trust in us and yet fear that we will merely cut and run whenever the next president thinks it's appropriate. But how much trust do the American people have in the U.S. military? I remember a time not so long ago when Americans often listed the military as one of the most trusted institutions. The latest polls can't find a majority who have great confidence in the military. Generals and admirals seem more intent in rooting out racism or white supremacy in their ranks rather than focusing on protecting freedom here and abroad. Our military is no longer a deterrent. Our enemies don't fear us. Our friends don't trust us. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have Dr. Arthur Brooks with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, From Strength to Strength. He is a social scientist who has studied human happiness. And just about the time your book came out, Dr. Brooks, there was also this article in the New York Times. Yale's happiness professor says anxiety is destroying her students. And that's Laurie Santos, who's a cognitive scientist. And this has been something that has been eluding not only those of us a little bit older and looking at what happens in the second part of our career, it also is affecting young people as well that find themselves, because of the lockdowns and the pandemic, really having difficulty finding happiness.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the great secrets of growing older and getting happier is remembering that the sources of youthful anxiety can be greatly mitigated, especially by 2 things: love of family and friends and faith in God. And one of the things that I do in this book, and if I were to respond to the pandemic of anxiety and depression that we actually do see among students, and I see it among my students at Harvard as well, is to simply remember the formula for a happy life. Now, again, as they say, the devil's in the details. It's hard to live a formula, but we have to remember what the right formula is. The world, Kirby, gives us a counterfeit formula for being happy. And that counterfeit formula that the world tells us in advertising and in entertainment and in media over and over again, the culture says to use people, love things, and worship yourself. And that's the wrong formula. And at every turn, it's the recipe for anxiety and depression. The right formula, which I talk about in my book, and I talk about how to live this formula, is very simple. Use things, love people, and worship God. That's it. I mean, this is the secret to the happiest possible life. Now, every day is not going to be blissful because, in point of fact, we need unhappiness to be fully alive. Christian people in particular, they understand that that life, part of life is suffering, and suffering is a very sacred thing, and we find out who we are, but we can only deal with it with a supernatural perspective on these things, surrounded by the people who love us and that we love in our life. And we're going to have empty lives, and we're going to see a lot of suffering for young people that's needless, that's useless, if we don't get on this right formula.
Let's see if we can talk a little bit about some of the steps. And of course, you have chapters on kick your success addiction, start chipping away, make your weakness your strength. If we can, since we only have a few minutes, maybe you can kind of go through those fairly quickly. I know some of our listeners are going to be writing these down as quickly as they can, or then get the podcast to write them down after the fact, because this gives you a sense of why this book is so, if you will, monumental. It's in some respects, some things we've known before, but you put all those pieces together as a social scientist into one book, and in 9 chapters and about 250 pages, it really does kind of set forth how to have this sense of purpose and happiness in life. Can you explain those to us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so delighted to say that it's the #1 New York Times bestseller right now. And this is not just in Christian audiences or religious audiences or conservative audiences, but people all over the country that want some of these ideas. I talk about addiction to worldly success, which mimics the same thing as addiction to drugs and alcohol, and how to kick that. I talk about the lack of love that people who are real strivers have in their life, because they forgot how to have real friends. They only have deal friends. And as we all know, real and deal are not the same thing. We need to deal with that. I talk about how to walk a more spiritual path in life, to integrate the principles of one's spiritual tradition, religious tradition, Christianity in my own case, of course, into my daily work. And then finally, I talk about one of the most important things that we can learn from the Apostle Paul about how to grow old in happiness, which is to embrace our weakness and share our weaknesses with other people, not to run away from our fears, but to embrace our fears, to share them such that people can see us as people just like them, to lift other people up. The secret to having more love is giving more love. To lifting up more people is to show them that we are human as well. Look, this is a step-by-step approach. This is the owner's manual for the human heart as we get older, and it's all based in the principles that we've known all along, but it has the science behind it. It goes step by step. And here's the claim. Each person who reads this book may not be the happiest person in the world, but each of us can be happier at 75 than we were at 25. And that's the kind of progress each of us deserves.
You know, one of the things I thought we might just focus on for just a minute is you've been talking about this for some time, the issue of earned success. And I said that in my Sunday school class when I was going to have you on, because we were in a particular passage in Proverbs that related very much to your book, was the fact that you have illustrated only so well that somebody that inherits money or somebody that wins the lottery doesn't have anywhere near the satisfaction as a person who, with a lot of work and toil, built a business or developed themselves as a musical expert or something of that nature. And there is a sense in which you would think that more people would study happiness. I mentioned, of course, the happiness professor at Yale, and of course yourself, but it's a pretty small group. And it seems to me that that's something you would have thought that social science would have spent a lot more time studying.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is for the longest time, people thought of happiness as a feeling, and that's not true. Happiness is not a feeling any more than your Thanksgiving dinner is the smell of the turkey. It's happy. Feelings come from happiness, but happiness is something that's quite scientifically tangible. Just as your Thanksgiving dinner is kind of a combination of protein, carbohydrates, and fat, the 3 macronutrients in all food, happiness is a combination of enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose in life. Each one of those things can be studied. In fact, is studied, and the more that we do so, the more that we can unlock the secrets and to find the mistakes that each one of us is making. It's inhibiting our ability to be joyful day to day, to share happiness and love with other people. So I walk through all of those things. And for example, I mean, I show in the book that our brains tell us, our brains lie to us, quite frankly,
Yes.
about the sources of enduring satisfaction. We think that money, power, pleasure, and fame will bring enduring satisfaction. It's not true. We have to shed those idols, because they just are idols, and go to the 4 virtuous goals that we should have. Truly, I showed the data. I mean, this is not any sort of theory at all. I've got the data that show that the happiest people, they invest in 4 different emotional investments every day: their faith, their family, their friendships, and their work. And their work has to have only two characteristics, as you said it correctly before, that they earn their success at their work and that they serve others with their work. These are all expressions of love. These are all gifts to us. And so I talk about exactly in the book how to do these things very intensively and on purpose.
And again, you talk about the fact that not only do we have the world lying to us, well, of course, our brains are lying to us as well. We need to, like you said, chip away, because right now we have a world that says satisfaction equals, as you talk about, continually getting what you want. Success is continually having more than others, and failure is having less. I can't think of anything that is more guaranteeing an individual to be depressed, despondent, than actually following those ideas, and yet both our brains and the world around us are telling us that that's how to be happy. Your book is a real good antidote to some of that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sure intended to be, and I offer it up in love to my sisters and brothers who need more of this. Now, the interesting thing to keep in mind is that, back in the 60s, hippies used to say, if it feels good, do it, and that's just a terrible strategy. It always has been a terrible strategy, because Mother Nature, the way that our caveman brains are formed is that they say that you'll pass on your genes if you have more money and power and pleasure and fame. And in terms of caveman, maybe it would be buffalo jerky and animal skins or something, but that's Mother Nature, who simply wants you to pass on your genes, have a lot of kids, get mates. We don't want those things because we're trying to live a more moral, a more civilized existence. Mother Nature doesn't care if we're happy. That's up to us. This is up to us to be more developed, to be more godlike. I mean, to live closer to the kingdom, to get something more like the beatific vision. People who live like animals, they live horribly. And to live like an animal, I'm not saying anything else except that you're pursuing money all the time,
Yes.
that you're pursuing power and fame all the time. Pursue the things that really matter. Happiness is love, your faith, your family life, your real friendships, and work that can truly serve other people. Again, I wrote this book as an offering to all of my sisters and brothers that are going through life wondering, what can I do to be happier? Well, the science is in, and it follows what your grandmother said, but we can actually paint it in even clearer pictures of a step-by-step process, and it can be ours.
Again, the book is From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life. We also have a link not only to the book, to arthurbrooks.com. First of all, you can sign up to get his bi-weekly updates. You can find out more where he might be speaking. You can watch the video of this whole story, which was featured on Netflix, and so much more. And, of course, you can find out about his other books. So, Dr. Arthur Brooks, it is always a delight to have you on the program. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
God bless you, and God bless all of our listeners. I hope we all go from strength to strength. Remember, this is from the Proverbs 84. In Hebrew, Michael El Chael. And so I simply wish you and all the listeners that we all go from strength to strength.
So good. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. And if you want more information about this, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And one of the things I would like to maybe hear from you is today is March 16th. And if you remember correctly, the date of March 16th, 2020 is the date in which we were told that 15 days to slow the spread. You remember that? That was 2 years ago. And so I'd love to get some comments from some of you about whether you thought that was a good idea, whether you at the time thought it was only going to be 15 days, whether you thought that these lockdowns would be a momentary action, we'd be back to normal, or whether you believed, as some of us did, that this might be around for a year or two, which it was, and whether or not the lockdowns were going to be that effective, as we talked about on this program. So again, because this is March 16th, I didn't want it to completely go away without mentioning what happened 2 years ago. We do have an article about that, and I will get to it later, but I thought it would be appropriate somewhere along the line to queue up some of the comments that some of you would want to make about that, because in some respects, we talk about December 7th, 1941. That's Pearl Harbor. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. We talk about September 11th, 2001. That's 9/11. This is maybe not as significant, March 16th, 2020, but it's not insignificant. And so it is one of the articles that we have posted on our website. But let's first of all talk about what has transpired so far. That is, the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, actually cited Pearl Harbor and the terror attacks on America on September 11th, 2001, today, as he appealed to the U.S. Congress to do more to help Ukraine fight against Russia. Now, this was a live stream into the Capitol complex, and he said the United States must sanction Russian lawmakers, block imports, and then actually showed this packed auditorium of members of Congress and other individuals in the administration, really kind of an emotional video of destruction and devastation that took place. And his argument was, we need you right now. I call on you to do more. And so in calling for more economic pressures against Russia, he said peace is more important than income. He received a standing ovation before he spoke. He received a standing ovation after he spoke. And we're now reaching kind of into the third week mark of this ever-escalating war that has taken place. And so he also implored the Allied leaders to, quote, close the sky. In other words, to basically have a no-fly zone. I don't see that happening, but again, I just thought that I would try briefly to report what he indeed said. And of course, you will be able to see some of that. I'm sure if you watch television tonight, you'll see it. If you go on YouTube, you can see it as well. In just a few minutes, I do want to get into the response, interestingly enough, in Russia, which is kind of intriguing. You have a number of academics at the oldest university in Russia, which is Moscow State University. I've not spoken there, but some of my colleagues have spoken there at Moscow State years ago. And it was kind of interesting back then, not now, but back then, there was a really significant amount of openness there. I used to jokingly say there might be more openness to talk about the gospel and Christianity at Moscow State University than at maybe Oklahoma State University or Ohio State University, something like that. But nevertheless, we'll get to that in just a minute, because also our good friend Jim Dennison, Dr. Jim Dennison, has put out a piece about the speech by the president of Ukraine. And he starts by, first of all, saying it is surreal to consider how different the world has become in 3 weeks. I think you would agree with me on that. He says, as of this morning, more than 3 million refugees have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began on February 24th. Ukrainian President Zelensky's speech today could be, many people say, the most important speech by a foreign leader since Churchill in 1941. We'll see, but it certainly was well received. The leaders of the Czech Republic and Poland and Slovenia traveled to Kyiv last night to meet with President Zelensky to offer a broad package of support. And the White House announced that President Biden will travel to Brussels, Belgium, for a March 24th NATO summit on the invasion. So quite a bit of things that are happening. And again, you have to recognize that these other countries that border Ukraine, and that, of course, is Poland, and it's Hungary and Romania, Moldova, and a number of others are all connected to that as well. A little bit later, Jim Dennison puts it this way. It is obvious that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is changing the world far beyond Ukraine. The question is how much. One individual, Veronica, and I'm not sure I can pronounce her last name, a journalist in Kyiv, writes in Atlantic, quote, "Every night I close my eyes thinking I might be next on Putin's death toll list. Nowadays, you never know where the Russians will drop their bombs onto a residential building, a kindergarten classroom, a monastery, or maternity hospital." By the way, those are not hypotheticals. Every one of those has been places where bombs have landed. She understands that the people of the West are scared of World War III, but she adds, "Don't you understand that World War III may have already arrived?" And so, again, some comments that appeared in The Atlantic by an individual that is actually on the ground. A couple more points, and after our break, I'll get into this letter that was put together by these academics at Moscow State. And then next hour, we'll get into, if you can bear it, what if we do have a tactical nuclear strike? What might that look like? And I'm not trying to scare people, but I'm also trying to help you understand some of the kinds of questions and thoughts and discussions and so I want to bring that to you as well. And then we'll get into some other issues in the news because obviously, we have a lot to talk about today. And if you want to join us, of course, 1-800-351-1212. First of all, Jim Dennison says Putin clearly wants to rebuild a new Russian empire, which would lead him to advance beyond Ukraine into NATO-allied countries and force the U.S. into a conflict. And actually, it is quite possible, as he says here, that Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons to win its war in Ukraine, which is why I want to talk about that next hour. And the same day, the United Nations Secretary of the United Nations reported the prospects of nuclear conflict once unthinkable is now back within the realm of possibilities. So I figure it was about time that we could cover that issue, and we will do so in the next hour. He also points out there's a connection, and there obviously is. Matter of fact, if you listen to my commentary today, you can see the connection between Ukraine and China, because China's continued escalation, he says, of its nuclear capabilities only adds to the growing danger. Charles Richard, who is the admiral who leads the U.S. Strategic Forces, which oversees military nuclear arsenal, told lawmakers last week, "Today we face two nuclear-capable near peers who have the capability to unilaterally escalate to any level of violence in any domain worldwide with any instrument of national power at any time." Not the word you want to hear. And as I've said before, if after you listen to these broadcasts you aren't on your knees praying, well, I guess I failed, because these are matters of very significant prayer. How do we think about this from a Christian point of view? Again, this piece by Jim Dennison goes on for some length, but let me just make a couple real quick comments. He says, by now your stress level is probably higher than it was when you began reading this article, and if you haven't been considering that the world has now surpassed 6 million COVID-19 deaths as the U.S. nears 1 million such tragedies. Vox has reported that the deaths of despair, that would be suicide, drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, and the rest, amount to the equivalent of a catastrophic pandemic every single year. And now we're dealing with an enemy that might deploy nuclear weapons with unforeseeable global consequences. But he reminds us, none of this surprises God. He's not reading these words with the same anxiety you and I might be feeling. And he says, since I am convinced that the Lord redeems all he allows, I ask myself today how he might redeem the fears of these perilous days instantly a simple thought occurred to me by showing us how deeply we need what only our Father can give. And so he gives you some other great points. Matter of fact, one of the people that works with the Denison Ministries is Josh Miller. And it's interesting because his piece that came out on their website, Blessed Are the Self-Sufficient, How the Anti-Beatitudes Explain Our Cultural Anxieties. And if you wanted to take the piece by Josh Miller and add it to the one that we just talked about a minute ago with Arthur Brooks, I think you got kind of a 1-2 punch to encourage you to maybe think biblically, not to think about these issues from a worldly point of view. Anyway, that's at least a little bit of an overview of what is taking place right now. We come back. I did want to, just since you probably have not seen it, read this letter from those in Russia who oppose Vladimir Putin, because I think it's tempting sometimes to paint with a broad brush. There are a lot of Russians that don't like what the president in Russia has done. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, once again, let's, if I can, for just a few minutes, read this letter from the Moscow State University Academy, and it includes 4,000 academics, professors and graduate students and others that have actually spoken out against Vladimir Putin. And I do it just to remind you that we are suffering somewhat in a very small way here in this country because of the sanctions. And I do want to, next hour, really address an issue issue, more because, if nothing else, Doug, our engineer, loves these economic issues. Why is it U.S. oil and gas producers aren't solving the energy crisis? Because there's an economic issue and there's regulatory issues. We'll talk about that. Of course, we're going to talk about this idea of tactical nuclear weapons and what that might mean, and a few others. And even one of the pieces we've posted here by Dennis Prager, is Ukraine in America's interest? But I also hope that next hour, as we open up the phones, some of you might want to comment on this very significant day. March 16th, 2020 is when we are supposed to have 15 days to slow the spread. How did that work out for you? 2 years later, what's your thoughts? Love to give you that forum to express that, not only to me, but to the rest of our listening audience. But let's, before we do that, get into this letter that came out. And this is bold because you recognize that some of the people that have opposed Vladimir Putin, they just disappear. And maybe there's strength in numbers. But here's what they say. We, students, graduate students, teachers, staff, and graduates of the oldest university in Russia, Moscow State University, actually are categorically condemning the war that our country unleashed in Ukraine. They say Russia and our parents gave us strong education, a true value which lies in being able to critically evaluate what is happening around, to weigh arguments, to hear each other, to be faithful to the truth, scientific and humanistic. We know how to call a spade, and we cannot stand aside. So here's what the letter goes on to say. Acting on behalf of the Russian Federation, which its leadership calls a special military operation, is war. And this is a situation, and in this situation, there is no room for euphemisms or excuses. War is violence, cruelty, death, loss of loved ones, powerlessness, and fear that cannot be justified by any goal. War is the most cruel act of dehumanization, which, as we studied within the walls of school and the university, should never be repeated. The values of the absolute human life, humanism, diplomacy, and peaceful resolution of contradictions, which we absorbed at the university, were trampled upon and thrown away in an instant when Russia treacherously invaded the territory of Ukraine. The lives of the millions of Ukrainians have been threatened every hour since the invasion of the military forces of the Russian Federation into Ukraine. They go on to make a couple of other comments. We express our support to the people of Ukraine and categorically condemn the war that Russia unleashed against the Ukrainians. As graduates of the oldest university in Russia, we know that the losses inflicted during the 6 days of a bloody war, first of all, human, but also social, economic, cultural, are inseparable. We also know that war is a humanitarian catastrophe, but we cannot imagine the depth of the wound that we, as the people of Russia, are inflicting on the people of Ukraine and ourselves right now. We demand that the leadership of Russia immediately cease fire, leave the territory of the sovereign state of Ukraine, and end this shameful war. We ask all Russian citizens who care about its future to join the peace movement because we are against war. Pretty powerful. And again, just a reminder that there are a lot of individuals, even in Russia, that did not want this military action, did not want this war, and are part of almost kind of a peace movement that is developed there in Moscow, right there at Moscow State University. So again, a point to keep in mind. And as we go to a break, let me just mention that one of the things that we've posted today is my commentary, which I call it the Afghanistan humiliation, because I raised the question in the first paragraph, why did Vladimir Putin decide to invade Ukraine? Well, yesterday I did explain to you in a little bit of detail how there is just sort of this unholy alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. The belief that really, if you're going to find the Jerusalem for the Russian Orthodox people, it is Kyiv, or used to be called Kiev. And so that is part of the reason for that. And so I certainly recognize that that's one of the reasons. But one of the other reasons why Vladimir Putin decided to go now, I argue, is because of the Afghanistan humiliation, because the military doesn't want you to talk about it. because they're responsible for parts of it. The establishment press haven't really talked about it as well because, it's old news and the focus should always be on the present, they think. And yet we have to understand that in an ideal world, the American military is supposed to act as a deterrent. Dictators and terrorists should think twice before challenging the U.S. military or even challenging the military actions that would involve us, for example, with a NATO country. In the best of all worlds, we would welcome the fact that the military might be such a deterrent that we would never have to use it. Of course, that brings me back to my commentary last Friday, which I talked about Chesterton's fence, because a lot of people said, why do we even need NATO? Because we haven't actually had to use it. Well, when NATO's working well, you don't need NATO. I think most people now know how important NATO is. All of a sudden, you've got President Biden going to go to NATO. But again, as I point out, we are no longer seen as a deterrent. The botched withdrawal of Afghanistan really changed all that. We left behind what some people estimate to be about $80 billion in military arms and other equipment. We left behind the Bagram Air Base, which, again, we spent, as the country, the United States spent about $96 million to develop those two long runways. We had $1 billion embassy in Kabul. It's owned by the Taliban now, as you can see. We just packed up, flew out, and frankly left behind a lot of people that should have been traveling with us. And so again, an effective military should frighten our enemies and encourage our allies. But do we really think that now, in light of what has happened, first in Afghanistan, what's even now starting to happen in Ukraine, whether other leaders in other countries are going to trust us? They may place their trust in us for a while, but in the back of their minds, at the very least, they might wonder if we might just merely cut and run whenever the current president thinks it's appropriate. And, of course, how much trust do we as Americans have of the military? It used to be in almost every poll, military was at the top of the list of institutions that were trusted. And in the latest polls, you couldn't find a majority. The one number I saw was 45% that have great confidence in the military. Now, I think there's some reasons for that. We've had generals and admirals that seem more intent in rooting out racism or white supremacy in their ranks rather than focusing on protecting our freedoms here and abroad. And so that, I think, is where we find ourselves today. The military is no longer a deterrent. Our enemies don't fear us, and our friends don't trust us. And so if you want to understand at least one more reason why Vladimir Putin thought it was appropriate to enter into Ukraine, there it is. And when we come back from the break, is he just so crazy that he might want to use tactical nuclear weapons? What do we know about that? I'm going to spend some time, not here to try to scare you, maybe just to force you to get to your knees and pray. And then we'll get into some of these other issues as well, because we do have very good evidence that Russia is actually launching some various missiles and rockets awful close to the NATO border. What do they have in mind there? And I'll try to answer some of the questions while we go through these sanctions. Why is it we just can't immediately just turn on the spigot and have a lot more oil coming from this country so that your gas prices go down? And there's some answers to that as well. And we'll cover all of that in the next hour right here on Point of View.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half-century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Story at pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about what about this idea of using tactical nuclear weapons. First of all, what's a tactical nuclear weapon in the first place? What would it mean, and how could it have an impact? And again, I'm going to be using most of what I'm going to be saying here coming from a very good piece by Jim Garrity. He writes for National Review, and I've always, first of all, 2 thumbs up for this individual. He does the kind of research that only a very, very few in the so-called establishment media are willing to do. And he refers to it as a hard look at the risk of a Putin-ordered tactical nuke. And we're going to get into this. And if you want to actually take some notes or think this through a little bit more, it's certainly a matter of prayer. And the reason we bring it up is, first of all, let's just be honest about the fact that the Secretary General of the United Nations warned, quote, raising the alert level of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back with the realm of possibility. So I've talked about this a little bit, but let's get into it in more detail. And Jim Garrity says, as hyperbolic as that claim may seem, he says the circumstances that would spur the Russians to use a tactical nuclear weapon are starting to fall into place. He says, for example, as I've talked about yesterday, because you can find his previous piece when he wrote about this, the war is going badly for the Russians. I think we already know that. We've talked about that. Matter of fact, the other day I quoted from the CIA director, who before that was an ambassador to Russia, probably knows the mindset of a Vladimir Putin as well as anybody, said that, he believes that Putin would be doubling down because the 4 assumptions that Vladimir Putin made, all 4 of those assumptions were incorrect. So that's the first issue. And so, of course, advances are moving slowly. Jim Garrity points out when they're moving at all, casualties are mounting. The Russian economy, as I've already talked about before, is collapsing. And so something's going to break, and you have to ask the obvious question, what's going to break first? Okay. Don't want to get too much into military policy, but Russia has a military doctrine, which is oftentimes referred to as escalate to de-escalate. That's the phrase they're using, escalate to de-escalate. That is this, quote, if Russia were subjected to a major non-nuclear assault that exceeded its capacity for conventional defense, it would de-escalate the conflict by launching a limited or tactical nuclear strike. In other words, really kind of the official strategy of the Russian military, as far as we know, is when losing a war is to escalate it by using tactical battlefield nuclear weapons in order to, quote, de-escalate it for favorable terms. First of all, don't you know, as I've said before, the first casualty in any war is language. De-escalate by escalate. Okay, but that's the philosophy. This is not surprising. This is not new. This is not something we did not know. This is something we do know. So Jim Garrity goes on to say, it isn't likely that Russia will launch or detonate a tactical nuclear weapon yet. But it also isn't unimaginable anymore. Apparently, Putin and the Russian military have been thinking about this option for a long time. Back in 2014, you have the Ukrainian defense minister at that time saying, quote, the Russian side has threatened on several occasions across the unofficial channels that in the case of continued resistance, they are ready to use a tactical nuclear weapon against us. Okay, couple definitions. What is a tactical nuclear weapon? Tactical is used to really talk about the fact that it probably, in most cases, is some kind of nuclear weapon that is launched from a short distance. It's just the opposite of, you might remember those huge things that look like something that would put man in space, these very large intercontinental ballistic missiles. You've probably seen those in the silos and things of that nature, and those are what you oftentimes see in doomsday various movies. Terminator would be a good example of that. Okay, those are land-based missiles in most cases, although some are sea-launched missiles and weapons as well. So the various levels and the actual size and range, varies. I'm not going to get into that because you probably don't need to know that either. But let's get back to the point. Okay, so this is launched from the battlefield in most cases. There's a couple of ways to detonate a nuclear weapon. All of them are pretty horrific, but let's, if we can, and if you actually want to take some notes, here are 4 different ways in which this might happen. The first is what's called an airburst. It's an explosion in which the weapon is detonated in the air at an altitude really below 30 kilometers, but at least at a sufficient height that the fireball does not contact the surface of the earth. After such a burst, blast can then create considerable damage and injury. The altitude of an airburst can be varied according to the blast effects and a number of other things, the thermal effects. Burns to exposed skin can be produced over several kilometers, eye injuries, all sorts of things there. And tactical airbursts are oftentimes used against ground forces. That's number 1. Number 2, surface bursts. That's an explosion in which a weapon is detonated on or slightly above the surface of the earth, so the fireball actually touches the land or water surface. Under these particular cases, there is initial nuclear radiation, which will be less extensive than for an airburst, but nevertheless, the ground zero, of course, is completely decimated. Number 3 is a subsurface burst. This is an explosion at which point the detonation is below the surface of the land or water. That causes cratering from kind of an underground burst, and as a result creates ground shock, water shock, and those kinds of things taking place as well. And local fallout will be very heavy if the penetration occurs. And the last and final one, and I'll come back and say more about what this means in just a minute, number 4, a high altitude burst. This is one in which the weapon is exploded very high, above 30 kilometers, which then has the initial X-rays coming down, and ultimately this becomes what is known as an EMP. We've talked about that on this program before, an electromagnetic pulse, which obviously can kill people, but ultimately what it does is kills any kind of communication, any kind of various kinds of computer chips and the rest. And so as a result, you have, modern cars that don't work, cell phones that don't work, computers that don't work, medical equipment that doesn't work, energy grids that don't work, something we have needed to protect ourselves from in this country. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about what that might mean if indeed any of those particular ideas or strategies are employed by Vladimir Putin. We'll move on to a couple of other issues, but you probably haven't heard many people talk about tactical nuclear weapons. I've had a chance to hear about it here on Point of View. We'll continue talking about that, then move on to some other topics, because after all, there's a lot to cover, and Ukraine is just one of many stories in the news. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Why did Vladimir Putin decide to invade Ukraine? There are many reasons. One that is often ignored is the Afghanistan humiliation. The American military don't want to mention it. They're responsible for much of it. The establishment press doesn't really want to talk about it. That's old news, and the focus is always on the present. In an ideal world, the American military is supposed to act as a deterrent. Dictators and terrorists should think twice before challenging the U.S. military. In the best of all worlds, we would welcome the fact that the military is such a deterrent that we never have to use it. The botched withdrawal from Afghanistan changed all of that. We left behind what some estimate to be $80 billion in military arms and other equipment. We left behind Bagram Air Base after having spent $96 million on 2 long runways. And don't forget the $1 billion embassy in Kabul. The U.S. packed up and flew out of the country, leaving behind many who deserve to travel with us. An effective military should frighten our enemies and encourage our allies. But does anyone seriously think leaders in other countries will trust us in the future? They may place their trust in us and yet fear that we will merely cut and run whenever the next president thinks it's appropriate. But how much trust do the American people have in the U.S. military? I remember a time not so long ago when Americans often listed the military as one of the most trusted institutions. The latest polls can't find a majority who have great confidence in the military. Generals and admirals seem more intent in rooting out racism or white supremacy in their ranks rather than focusing on protecting freedom here and abroad. Our military is no longer a deterrent. Our enemies don't fear us. Our friends don't trust us. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking for just a few more minutes about this idea of a tactical and nuclear weapon use and strike that might come from Russia. Just a minute ago, I mentioned different options of the air burst, number 1, surface burst, number 2, subsurface burst, number 3, and number 4, which may be the most likely, a high-altitude burst, because Jim Garrity points out the fact that Vladimir Putin may well want portions of Ukraine devastated, but not to be irradiated. I mean, again, if you can think of a particular institution in the northern part of Ukraine called Chernobyl. Nobody goes to Chernobyl, and nobody wants to go into a country where the radiation level is still high, which is why I think that an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, could do something that might allow him to then get a strategic advantage. Now, up until now, I've been pretty dismal, haven't I? Sometimes when we get talking about these issues, I go in during the break and talk to my producer, Steve, when he's here and say, I'm just a regular bluebird of happiness here, aren't I? But okay, let's talk about a few things. There are some things that might actually prevent this. And one of those is that now we're getting into the spring. And it turns out that the winds in Ukraine generally blow in an eastern or southeastern direction. And so that would mean that certainly in the eastern part of Ukraine, it would blow radioactive fallout back into Russia. Now, again, a man that seems almost as evil as Vladimir Putin has been lately hard to imagine that that would bother him, but nevertheless, something to mention for sure. Let's, if we can, maybe quote from a couple of other people that know a lot more about this than you and I. One is an individual, Al Moroni, who is the director of the United States Air Force Center for Strategic Deterrence Studies. Now, he's not necessarily speaking on behalf of the U.S. Air Force or the Defense Department or the Pentagon, but he said one course of action, he believes, is that there could be, by Vladimir Putin, what he calls a demonstration strike with a single low-yield nuclear detonation in Ukraine or over the Black Sea to serve as a dramatic warning that resistance to Russia's military campaign must be ended, backed by a compelling threat of further tactical nuclear attacks. A Russian nuclear attack on Ukraine would not directly target the U.S. or NATO forces, although certainly it would be a direct signal to nations that, if nothing else, what we are dealing with here is an individual that is going to actually up the ante and want to escalate in order to de-escalate, as they've said before. So again, it's possible that Russia could detonate a low yield, that'd be less than 5 kilotons, nuclear weapon as an airburst over, Ukrainians' mechanized brigade outside of Kyiv. As a result, the long-term effects of fallout would be avoided, but at the same time, since Ukraine is not a NATO member, there's no necessarily trigger for NATO retaliatory strike, and so that would be a possibility. Again, he's speaking for himself, not necessarily speaking for the Defense Department, but appreciate him suggesting that that is another alternative. One other point I thought we might make as well is if you go over to a very good journal called Scientific American, you have a Brown University professor, Nina Tettenwald, who points out that even the smallest tactical nuclear strike would make an existing destruction of the war seem small, especially if it was detonated anywhere near a town or city. Here's what the professor says. A thermonuclear explosion of any size possesses overwhelming destructive power. Even a small yield nuclear weapon, that'd be 1/3 of a kiloton, could produce damage far beyond that of conventional explosives. It would also cause all of the horrors of Hiroshima, albeit on a smaller scale. A tactical nuclear weapon would produce a fireball, shock waves, and deadly radiation that could cause long-term health damage to survivors. Radioactive fallout could contaminate air, soil, water, and the food supply. And of course, as she points out, the Ukrainians are already pretty much familiar with the outcome of what happened with the meltdown of Chernobyl back in 1986. So again, the arguments are that certainly we want to see what we can do by aiding the Ukrainians to repel the Russian invaders. I don't see any way that we actually implement a no-fly zone, though that is certainly what President Zelensky has called for. There doesn't seem any way at the moment where NATO troops will actually be put on the ground in Ukraine. And the real question is that discussion we had just the other day about the fact that Poland has these MiG-29s, which, again, were originally supposed to be then transferred from Poland to, of course, our air base in Germany and then to Ukraine. And of course, then the president decided against that. But those are some options, and yet those don't seem to be the ones that are going to be used. So scary as it might be to talk about the idea of a tactical nuclear weapon, I figured it would at least be worth our time to spend some time talking about that, and that is something that you can read more about if you would like to do so. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that I quoted yesterday very briefly from Dennis Prager's piece, but it is our second article today in which he asked a very good question. Is Ukraine in America's interest? And he says, if you're talking about people on the left, asking is this in America's interest is a moot question. because he says on the left, America's interest is regarded as essentially, as he said, chauvinistic, nationalistic, even fascistic term. But unlike the left, he says, the people on the right are asking this question: what is in America's interest? And he says that's one of the reasons why the Trump-era slogan, America First, so resonated with conservatives, because we believe that open borders is a prescription for destroying a country, that becoming less energy independent then puts us at the mercy of, we were just talking off air, Venezuela, Russia and Iran. Do we really want to be buying oil from those individuals? I think you know the answer to that. And a variety of other issues. So we recognize that there are some things that need to be front and center in terms of our interest. We come back from the break, I'm going to talk about, is it possible that oil and gas producers can produce more oil? And you'll begin to realize how all these climate change rules and regulations already make it very difficult. Also, we actually closed down a lot of those oil rigs. Can't get them started just overnight, but I'll get to that in just a minute. So again, he reminds us that when Ukraine, back in 1994, gave up its nuclear weapons, which it inherited, by the way, from the Soviet Union, it signed an agreement. It is known as the Budapest Memorandum with Russia. And that actually was with Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States, and others, that it agreed to dismantle its nuclear weapons and delivery systems. That would be bombers and missiles. In return, Ukraine was assured that Russia, the United States, and the UK would refrain from threatening it and respect its independence and sovereignty. Well, that hasn't gone so well, has it? And of course, the point he makes is then the question some people ask: what Putin is doing is wrong, but it's essentially none of our business. The United States has no interest in Ukraine. Well, Dennis Prager makes this argument, and I've seen some make it one way or the other, but I wanted you to hear these different kinds of arguments. He says, look, other than an attack on America, when and where does America have an interest, and why? If a Russian dictator can invade and decimate another country in an act of unprovoked aggression, it is not in the if it's not in the best interest. What about China invading Taiwan, or Iran unleashing nuclear weapons against Israel, or North Korea doing the same against South Korea? Why is Taiwan, Israel, or South Korea more in America's interest than Ukraine? Again, I think you could come back and say, because that's in Europe, and we are less dependent on some of those things that come out of Ukraine. You could. But he's still saying, look, I've always supported the idea of America first, but as a conservative, and he says as a religious conservative, I do not believe in America only. For the same reasons I believe in my family first, but I do not believe in my family only. And so he says if conservatism means America first and only that, then that's fine. But if conservatism means America only, he says, well, then count me out. So again, it's the second article. It makes the case that we should be concerned about what is happening in Ukraine, but especially Taiwan, Iran, and North Korea. And we've talked about some of those before. We come back from the break, though. Let me answer some of the questions some of you have. Why can't we just get back and push some buttons and bring in all the energy so we don't have to buy it from Iran or Venezuela? I'll give you some very concrete answers right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, an open line. In just a minute, I'll talk a little bit about why oil and gas producers aren't able to solve our energy crisis at the moment and why it has become so necessary for us to buy oil from Venezuela and other countries. But I also want to take some phone calls. So let's, if we can, take a call to get us started in the conversation. And then we're also going to remind you that 2 years ago today, that was March 16th, 2020, 15 days to slow the spread. I'd love to get some comments from you about that. We'll head out first to Maine, and what's up, WSCW, and Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kirby. Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I think it was interesting something you said about what Dennis Prager made a comment, and then you read some different people's types of thoughts and responses to that. And it's not surprising in today's world that people would think that it's none of our business. We should just stay out of it. But I mean, my feeling is that it's much the same as if your neighbor was being attacked and you stood and did nothing because you didn't want to get involved, or would you try to help that person from injury and harm? I think, most people would say, yeah, absolutely. You would help that person, especially if it was an elderly person or a person that was otherwise unable to defend themselves fairly.
Sure.
Youngster.
Great argument.
And I think it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think it's a great argument because, again, even in the neighborhood, my wife and I walk twice a day and we get to know our neighbors. So if you see something doesn't look right, I'm one of those see something, say something. But sometimes I don't even have to wait to have the police show up. If I see a dog running away, I go grab that dog and get it back into their backyard. If I see some kid doing something that might look like vandalism, I'm going to come up to the kid and see what I can do to prevent that from happening. And we do that, and we used to believe that, and we used to talk about our neighbors. As a matter of fact, a very good book that I did mention in passing in the first hour by Arthur Brooks on Love Your Enemies, this idea of community and the fact that we really should work together at a time when so much is being used to split us apart. And I think your argument's really good because we would protect our neighbor's house if they were in danger. Why shouldn't we also protect other freedom-loving democracies around the world? That should be something the United States should be able to do, and if it can do it, should be. There are obviously some things we can't do. We can't really solve the problems inside Russia and China because they're such powerful nations, and so we see human rights abuses we can't do anything about. But when we can, I think we should. I think that's really kind of the essence of the Christian message. So I appreciate you calling in. Good point. Again, we always have such great insight from our listeners, and that gives you a chance. If you'd like to join the conversation, I'd love to even start getting some calls from you as we look back to 2 years ago, March 16th, 2020. Did you have any idea that after those 15 days, there'd be another 15 days, and then another couple of months, and then a year, and on and on? Love to get some thoughts about that in just a minute. And again, Steve makes a good point because my commentary last Friday was about this idea that we are responsible for protecting individuals. And the tendency sometimes is to think that everybody's going to do the right thing. And yet we live in a dangerous world. There are criminals, there are terrorists, and they're dictators. And so I use the example not just to talk about NATO, because a lot of people think, oh, why do we need NATO? We haven't needed it in a long time. I think we need it now. A lot of people said, hey, we don't really need to keep funding the U.S. military. We really, if anything, we're just withdrawing from various military actions like Afghanistan. What about the law enforcement? Oh, remember that? Defund the police? We want to defund the military. And why do we need a wall on our southern border and all the rest of that? And the example I used in my Friday commentary is everybody knows the famous line out of A Few Good Men. Remember what that was? You can't handle the truth. But I think the line after it was even more important because that's where Colonel Nathan Jessup says, son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. And so men and women with guns in the military, in law enforcement, are what keep us safe. And there's this kind of naive idea that if we just do the right thing, everybody else will do the right thing, and we'll all just be able to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. That hasn't worked out so well, has it? Well, just before I take some more phone calls, and again, I'd love to get your thoughts about the 2-year anniversary of 15 days to slow the spread. Let's see if we can try real quickly to answer a question that some of you have been asking. And I hear it enough that I thought it was worth mentioning for a few minutes. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes, and then we'll get back into this whole idea of 15 days to slow the spread. But this comes from a man by the name of Dr. Paul Tice. He is actually an adjunct professor of finance at New York University's School of Business. And actually, I guess it's not a doctor, it's just Mr. Paul Tice. Anyway, why oil and gas producers aren't solving the energy crisis. Here we go. He says, on the back of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, crude oil prices jumped from $100 a barrel, and the average cost of U.S. gasoline has surpassed $4 a gallon. It's been all over the place. You know, what did we say it was up there, Doug, 138 or something like that? Yeah, and it's dropped below that, but okay. He's my economics expert here, so I always like to have him when we're talking about these issues. And he says, again, production has barely budged over the past 2 years and still remains stuck below 12 million barrels a day, which is about 10 to 15% below the pre-pandemic high. Okay, so far, so good. What's the problem? Well, we've got a couple. Problem number one, these oil rigs, well, when you have a pandemic and a lockdown, nobody's using the oil. So the total U.S. oil rig count at the moment is at about 75% of where it was 2 years ago. Remember that March 16th, 2020. Okay. So we're still not up to where we were 2 years ago in March before the lockdown. That's the first thing. He also goes on to say, first and foremost, the U.S. shale got a wake-up call about its business model in 2020. That's when the combination of OPEC plus oil market share battle and pandemic lockdowns briefly turned crude oil prices negative. Does anybody remember that? Doug remembers that, but nobody else probably does. And that, of course, decimated the energy sector. So you say, okay, well, now we're doing a lot better. But when you have, can you remember this? The crude oil prices were negative. That's just amazing. So again, part of the problem is now that U.S. oil and gas producers need to extend their drilling inventories and permit runways further into the future. But the problem is the Biden White House is canceling or slow walking the leases on federal lands by crawling back acreage for national monuments. Now, it is true. Jen Psaki said, look, they have a number of these leases they're not using. Can I explain to you that if you have a lease for a dry well, you don't want to keep drilling, okay? So, yes, you might have a lease for something not producing oil, but the bottom line is you aren't actually going to be able to do in any kind of way to get the oil out of the ground, so you're going to let that lease lapse. Guess we're at $95 a gallon, barrel, you know, and there you go. Okay, so he says the main risk to the industry now has been this whole idea of supply chain bottlenecks, which are really created by government officials. A lot of that has to do with these various kinds of regulations. And then he goes on to point out that the U.S. energy companies have kind of wised up of the fact that if you're going to be talking about man-made climate change, that's going to have a real impact on you in terms of additional regulations that makes it harder and harder to actually get fossil fuel. And he even then points out one more, because the latest front in that issue has been what's called the Sustainable Investment Movement, which is in Wall Street, which actually says that it is now you're looking at environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues, ESG. You probably heard about that. If you haven't, go look it up. You'll see some YouTube videos on this as well. And so as a result, the first step towards screening and excluding politically incorrect industries such as oil and gas from investment portfolios, and so that's affected them as well. So we're dealing with a multitude of issues, but again, Mr. Tice at the end of his article says this: why aren't American oil and gas companies producing more barrels to help tamp down oil and gasoline prices during a global market shock when domestic inflation is rampant? His answer is, Well, as with everything that revolves around climate change, and it is complicated. So, as much as we'd like to get to more and more internal and domestic oil and gas production, there's some structural limitations, some economic regulations, and of course, government regulations and limitations that actually limit what we can pull from the ground effectively. Let's take a break. When we come back, let's think about 2 years ago, March 16th, 2020. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, I didn't want to let this day get away without at least acknowledging that 2 years ago, on March 16th, 2020, was a day that maybe won't be up there with December 7th, 1941, or certainly 9/11, 2001, but it was significant because you might remember that that was the day in which we were told 15 days to actually slow the spread. And this piece is our third article by Julie Kelly. She is an editor and writer and commentator. Never had her on the program. Maybe I should do that someday. But again, she entitles this, and you can read it in its entirety because I'm only going to summarize it, from 15 days to 2 years. And she said, you know, back in March of 2020, once free citizens around the world surrendered their liberty and livelihoods in a futile attempt to stop the virus, the most technologically advanced civilization in the history of mankind quickly adopted medieval fixes that bordered on quackery sold by snake oil salesmen in the credential class and news media, codified through executive fiat by elected leaders in both parties. Okay, she doesn't mince words, but she is convinced that that was a disaster, and love to get your thoughts about that as well. She says, just 15 days, we were told, on March 16, 2020, to slow the spread. Do your part to promote the common good, the historic rallying cry for anyone that actually wants to actually extend their power, and that was certainly the case. She tells a story about her daughter going off to college and some of the things she was writing and all the criticism she received there. But then she goes on to remind us this happened under the presidency of Donald Trump. And she says that he made what she says, catastrophic decision to acquiesce to the demands of Dr. Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, and as a result to shut down the country, not just for 2 weeks, but for basically what has almost been 2 years this week. And it really says that although his first instinct wasn't necessarily there, he went along with that. And as she points out in the third page, the cure, in some respects, got worse, because emboldened by their success in forcing Donald Trump to authorize the first 15-day shutdown, then Fauci and Birx took a step further with other predictions. And by the way, one of those models we knew fairly early on were not accurate, but when you start talking about, 2 million Americans dying, well, that gets your attention, even though it turns out that the model wasn't even close to accurate. But again, hindsight is 20/20. Let's go on. But with these projection models in hand, they went to the White House at the end of March 2020 and convinced Donald Trump to extend the lockdowns another month. And she argues that that decision sealed his electoral fate. The booming economy went into a death spiral. And it's amazing how short people's memories are. Even before the election in November of 2020, I had and could find individuals saying, well, Trump was a complete failure because, after all, look at the economy. And I just wanted to say to these individuals, look at the economy before March 16th. Yes, we know what happened after March 16th, but that was due to the pandemic and the lockdown. But again, people's memories are very short, and so you can get away with those kind of comments. But that, of course, as she says, probably sealed his fate as much as anything. Now, in the midst of that, there weren't just people against the lockdowns. There were a lot of people for that. And it wasn't just the people that were bringing the lockdowns and seeing this as a way to maybe extend their power and influence over their particular constituency, because she points out that lockdowns that were also cheered were from the environmental groups that actually were thrilled that we hit a worldwide low of carbon dioxide emissions in 2020, in which they said, quote, the decline in emissions is without precedent in human history. Broadly speaking, this is the equivalent of removing all of the European Union's emissions from the global total, unquote. By the way, I've got a booklet I'm working on the Great Reset. And when we talk about that, one of the things people have said is, well, that reset might actually give us a plan for the future. That's for another day. Then she goes and saying that now fast forward to where we are now, and just as the various figures in terms of energy using were starting to rebound, we then now have the Russian-Ukrainian war, which presented another opportunity for what she calls sort of a soft form of lockdowns. With gas prices rapidly rising, Americans are going to probably use less energy, and that is the case. And then she goes on to say that the Biden administration fully admits the conflict will accelerate plans to move the country's energy independence, move them from the independence of gas and oil to wind and solar. And again, the goal that was actually articulated by candidate Joe Biden and now President Joe Biden is to cut carbon emissions in half by 2030. And of course, even though he was not able to pass his Build Back Better plan, the attempt to so-called reset our priorities is still on front and center. And the other day I talked about that particular piece of legislation that monstrosity of 2,700 pages that made its way through Congress that included some of that as well, including a whole section on so-called economic justice. Well, are there any kind of issues to address today? Well, she picks out at least one hero, and that is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who she says was the only leader to express regret for authorizing shutdowns in his state under pressure at the time by the Trump White House, and where he questioned whether the science will change because you have a midterm election coming up. That's maybe a little overstatement. I think there are some others that have expressed regret, but that is the case. Unless you think that we now have the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown mindset in our rearview mirror, she ends with a couple of points, and one of those is that Pfizer just announced the other day that a fourth shot will be necessary for vaccinated people, and an annual booster will be recommended for all Americans as we learn to live with COVID-19. The CEO then went on to various programs, but one of those was on CBS Face the Nation, in which he said, what we see now after we are able to step up and provide solutions, a significant uplift on the reputation of the industry. Yeah, that's really true. People at the moment have really been much more excited about Big Pharma because they supposedly helped us with the pandemic. But if nothing else, I did want to post this as our third article by Julie Kelly, 15 days to 2 years. And just a reminder again that back on March 16th, 2020, did any of us see this kind of extended lockdown continuing? And there were some of us that said, this is going to last for more than a year. We just didn't know it was going to be pretty much 2 years. But here we are, the 2-year anniversary of the lockdowns, and something to notice and to mention at least, so that we don't forget maybe some of the lessons we've learned, so we are much more careful about applying them in the future. Well, let me just mention that tomorrow Robert Borelli will be with us, Paul Copan, and we'll probably get into a few issues in the news. And then Friday is our weekend edition, and Kelly Shackelford will be with us, Keisha Russell, and so we're looking forward to that as well. If you'd like to know more about the book by Arthur Brooks, that's on our website. These 3 articles are there as well. And most importantly, I want to thank the engineer I've been mentioning a couple times here, Doug, as well as Elisa, my producer today, while our other producer is in Spain. And when we get back tomorrow, we'll spend some time getting into a couple more issues in the news. And of course, Friday is our weekend edition. So all sorts of great material available at our website. If you'd like to hear it again, click on the button that says watch or listen. If you'd like to read some of the articles, click on those. And my Viewpoints commentary today is on the Afghanistan humiliation, which may be at least one reason why Vladimir Putin has invaded Ukraine. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half-century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Story@pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.